Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your co-host, Joanne.
And on today's episode, January 14th, 2017, we talked to David Chibo, independent journalist and author of a recent article on the deep state. But before we do that, here is Around the Empire. We begin with the United States European Command and the escalation on Russia's border. CNN reports some 4,000 U.S. soldiers have been deployed as part of troop rotations to Europe that the Pentagon has said are intended to bolster ties with NATO allies and send a clear message to Russia. American soldiers, quote, stand united on Polish soil to deter and defend, said Major General Timothy McGuire, Deputy Commander of U.S. Land Forces in Europe. He added that the troops' arrival was a, quote, concrete sign of the continued U.S. commitment to the defense of Poland and NATO alliance. The 3rd Armored Combat Brigade Team of the 4th Infantry Division is highly capable ready force, according to him. To maintain combat readiness, the soldiers will conduct, quote, realistic exercises, unquote, with allies and locations across Poland and Europe, McGuire added. Russia has criticized the continuous deployments as a threat to Russian security. To the United States Pacific Command in the disputed South China Sea, President-elect Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, former ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, made waves internationally on Thursday by suggesting that the U.S. should, quote, send China a signal that, first, the island building stops, and second, your access to those islands also is not going to be allowed, unquote, according to Business Insider. China's response, at first muted, has come back strong, with Chinese media saying, quote, unless Washington plans to wage a large-scale war in the South China Sea, any approaches to prevent Chinese access to the islands will be foolish, unquote. Tillerson had better bone up on nuclear power strategies if he wants to force a big nuclear power to withdraw from its own territory, said the Global Times, a Chinese state media outlet. The South China Sea has continued to be a focus of tensions, with China claiming certain territorial waters that Japan and South Korea believe belong to them. And from the United States Africa Command, Pentagon Media Stars and Stripes reports that the Islamic extremist group based in northern Nigeria, Boko Haram, is splintered, weaker, and less organized than it was a year ago. But the Nigerian terrorist group remains a threat to the region, according to U.S. Africa Command. AFRICOM's assessment of Boko Haram, which the command estimates has, quote, a few thousand members, unquote, follows a Christmas Eve announcement by Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari that the extremist group has been routed from its last stronghold and was on the run. Boko Haram has killed thousands of civilians. It has been regarded as one of the world's most lethal insurgent groups. It garnered global attention in 2014 when it kidnapped about 200 schoolgirls, and launching the social media viral plea hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. AFRICOM has also expanded its intelligence gathering efforts in the region, including a drone site in Niger. On to the United States Southern Command. According to a NATO press release, NATO Deputy Secretary General Ambassador Alexander Verschbau welcomed Colombia's interest in broadening consultations and cooperation with the NATO alliance. And he had talks with Colombia's Vice Minister of Defense, Jorge Enrique Bedoya. During the meeting, the Deputy Secretary General reiterated NATO's readiness to explore the potential for doing more together. Possible areas of future cooperation would include ammunition safety and military training courses. Closer cooperation is a gradual process that will evolve over time, Ambassador Verschbau said. Colombia already engages in several NATO programs and activities. This includes the participation of Colombian experts in NATO's Building Integrity Initiative, which promotes transparency in the defense sector, quote-unquote transparency. Colombia also participates in NATO codification activities, which seek to set common logistics standards, which, for those who don't know, is to help them sell arms. In June 2013, NATO and Colombia signed an agreement on the security of information, which sets the basis for NATO and Colombia to explore future cooperation and consultation in areas of common interest. The agreement is a first step towards Colombia being considered a NATO partner. Colombia's participation in additional NATO-run activities will continue to be decided by allies on a case-by-case basis. So there you have it, folks. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has a close consultation partnership with Colombia, which is not in any way connected to the North Atlantic. Now to United States Central Command. Syria reconciliation deal continues. Al-Masdar reports that rebels from 3 towns along the Golan Heights border with Israel have come to an agreement with the Syrian military and will surrender in exchange for safe passage to Idlib. Idlib is where current rebels, who have been removed from other places in Syria, including Aleppo, are stationed and have a stronghold. Turkey terror attacks likely to continue. Patrick Cockburn of The Independent says the terror attacks in Turkey are carried out by three different groups: ISIS, Kurdish rebel groups or Kurdish independence fighters, and Fethullah Gulen associated groups who are powerful and aren't going anywhere. Therefore, the frequent terror attacks are likely to continue with unrelenting savagery whatever the government does, unquote. Both ISIS and the PKK have established powerful de facto states of Syria and Iraq, something that could only have happened because of President Erdogan's ill-conceived involvement in the Syria civil war after 2011. And it's impossible to stop these kinds of attacks where, quote, civilians are the targets and the killers are prepared to die, unquote. The attacks and the government response is not causing national unity, but instead is tearing the country apart further and radicalizing puritanical Islamic factions. Turkey has played a double game in the Syrian civil war, first supporting the rebels, helping insurgents cross the border into Syria to overthrow Assad, and now looking to play a more constructive role in the peace process. And finally, the United States Northern Command and the recent leaks and stories about President-elect Donald Trump's time in Russia. BuzzFeed dropped a document apparently created by a former MI6 operative, Christopher Steele, which included various allegations, some of which were absurd, and even BuzzFeed itself admitted were wrong. It happened after CNN noted that the dossier created by Steele had been briefed, or at least been included in a packet that was briefed to President-elect Trump as well as President Obama. In a press conference, Trump condemned Penn as fake news for spreading the unverified and incorrect report. Later, the Washington Post reported on contacts between incoming National Security Advisor, retired General Michael Flynn, and the Russian ambassador. The leaks came, according to the Washington Post, from senior officials in the government. The White House has officially denied they were the source, which begs the question, who was the source? So why is there all this document dumping and intelligence leaks? Is the deep state at war with Donald Trump? Who is the deep state? Our guest, David Chibo, answers that question next.
Okay, that was Around the Empire. Today, Dan and I are talking to David Chibo. David is a fellow engineer and an independent journalist. We're going to be discussing the deep state and David's recent article at unz.com, titled Political Science's Theory of Everything, where David uses a famous Indian story of the blind men and the elephant as a metaphor to explain the hidden forces guiding the U.S. government. Hello, David.
Hi, Joanne, and hi, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
We're so happy to have you. Thanks so much for joining us. And before we get started, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yes, I'm an Australian-born Syrian. I'm not sure if you guys know who the Syrians are. They are an ancient people, Aramaic-speaking Christian minority that originated in Iraq and have since been dispersed throughout the Middle East. I was actually born in Australia, as I mentioned, and I have since returned to the homeland in 2002. I was part of a group that returned to help on a humanitarian mission. We were able to see the Kurds and the Syrian people working on projects such as electrifying of villages, setting up of computer centers and conducting courses. This was, of course, prior to the US invasion in 2003. When George W. Bush, of course, invaded and liberated the country's oil. Since then, I have been active in writing articles for publications such as Zinda magazine, Naqusha magazine, as well as Australian online publications such as abc.net.au. And I have recently delved into the deep state, having done extensive research to understand exactly who is the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak. And I have in my latest article revealed how the US elephant looks like in terms of in all its parts and in all its glory, so to speak.
So part of the reason why we're talking about the deep state today is that we've all been observing the events unfold after the 2016 presidential election in the United States. Numerous journalists and analysts have commented that they believe that the deep state is battling Donald Trump right now. So while we all have an idea of what that means, what the deep state means, David's article draws on the work of many others who've written about the deep state in his UNS.com analysis. And we think it's important to understand what's going on and who might be involved. Everyone can read David's article, and we'll provide a link to that in the show notes for our listeners. But we also have the advantage of having David here to share that analysis with us firsthand. So David, can you give us an overview first? And then perhaps we'll get into some of the details and questions. Dan and I will have questions as we go along. And we can later on, we can try to apply that analysis to the current events as best we can. So I'll turn it over to you, David.
Okay, if I can, I'm not sure if anyone's watched the Fight Club. It's that movie in which Edward Norton, who plays a narrator, actually talks about his alter ego, who is Tyler Durden. The film is actually quite important because at one stage he finally realizes that he is Tyler Durden. And if I can use that metaphor for the US government, what I call the US establishment is split between two personalities. So the visible side, we all know what we call the US government, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches. But hidden beneath the visible government is also an invisible government, which my paper calls the corporate deep state. Now, this is what I actually map. For the first time in history, we can actually map it now, thanks to the people I've called blind men, but are in fact giants. And upon their shoulders, I have managed to see far, if I can paraphrase Isaac Newton. I'll start off with the first blind man. He was Professor Wright Mills, and his book, The Power Elite, which was published in 1956, was a full-scale study of the structure and distribution of power in the US. And according to Mills, there are three hierarchies, or if I can call them factions of power within the US. There is the political faction, the military faction, and the economic faction. They're all interlocking and form a class. Now, the power elite, of course, use the media to broadcast their opinions to people they derogatively refer to as the masses. They are led to believe and regurgitate what the power elite feed them. The second blind man is, of course, FBI agent Dan Smoot. His book, titled The Invisible Government, also charts the gradual infiltration of the US government by the secret societies. He discusses the Council on Foreign Relations at the time. It was established in 1921 by Colonel Edward House, and he had links to international bankers in New York as well as great financial institutions. Smoot explains how the aim of the secret society was to entangle America or get them entangled in foreign wars. Now, the US corporations were also funding other global secret societies such as the Bilderbergers, or also known as the Bilderberg Group, whose name derives from the location of their first meeting in the Bilderberg Hotel in the Netherlands in May 1954. Now, the third blind man I detail in my article is the US Air Force Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who was an early critic of the CIA that stood then at the head of the security state. His book, called The Secret Team and published in 1973, charts the modern security state which was established by President Harry S. Truman in 1947. And this seminal event marked the start of what we call the security state. He goes on to define the power source of the CIA as a center of a vast and amorphous mechanism that specializes in covert operations, or as Alan Dulles always called it, peacetime operations. In other words, the CIA, what he's saying, is a willing tool of a higher cabal that may include representatives and highly skilled agents of the CIA and other participants of the government. Within this unique position, the CIA can prod other arms of the government into doing its bidding. Prutti goes on to explain how the CIA's greatest strength derives from its ability to activate various parts of the US government, usually the Defense Department, with minor inputs designed to create reaction. Now, the fourth blind man that I detail in my article is Professor of Economics, Jeffrey D. Sachs, and the pioneer of what Naomi Klein refers to as shock therapy, which is effectively free market fundamentalism of privatization, deregulation, and cutting of government subsidies met with debt relief and foreign aid. In his New York Times listed book, The Price of Civilization, Reawakening American Virtue and Prosperity, published in 2011, he laments that US political power has been usurped by four powerful corporate interest groups or lobbies. He refers to these four groups as the corporatocracy. He names them as Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, big oil, and the healthcare industry. Sachs is scathing of the government for turning the levers of power over to the corporate lobbies. Sachs explains how a healthy economy is a mixed economy in which government and the marketplace both play their role. However, the federal government has neglected its role for over 3 decades now. The fifth blind man is Professor of Economics and proud member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is, of course, a secret society, Michael J. Glennon. In his book, National Security and Double Government, he debunks the myth that the US security policy is forged by Americans' visible Madisonian institutions. In other words, the President, Congress, and the courts. Their roles have become largely illusory. Presidential control is now nominal, congressional oversight is dysfunctional, and judicial review is negligible. Glennon's book details the gradual shift in power that has occurred as the Madisonian institutions gradually became hollowed out and their impermanent custodians were gradually replaced by a concealed, non-elected, perpetual Trumanite network. Glennon goes on to describe how the Trumanite network, mostly immune from constitutional and electoral restraints, consists of several hundred executive officials who sit atop the military, intelligence, diplomatic, and law enforcement departments and agencies that have as their mission the protection of America's international and internal security. The sixth blind man in my paper is, of course, Professor Peter Dale Scott, who is considered the father of deep politics. His book is called The American Deep State, Wall Street, Big Oil, and the Attack on U.S. Democracy. And his book depicts what is fundamentally a schizophrenic American government. He highlights the two levels of government in America. The more familiar one is, of course, the law-enacting government consisting of a Senate, House of Representatives, and President. Meanwhile, the second hidden government operates on a deeper level and is composed of the national security apparatus, intelligence agencies, and armed forces. The final blind man is, of course, congressional aide Mike Lofgren, whose 2016 book titled The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of a Shadow Government describes the deep state as a hybrid of national security and law enforcement agencies hiding in plain sight, which Lofgren cites as the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Justice Department are all part of the deep state. He goes on to say, we also include the Department of Treasury because of its jurisdiction over financial flows, its extensive bureaucracy devoted to enforcing international economic sanctions, and its organic symbiosis with Wall Street. The deep state government agencies, as he says, have a symbiotic relationship with private enterprise, including the military-industrial complex, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. The CIA and NSA are especially dependent on Silicon Valley. Lofgren explains how after Edward Snowden's revelations about the extent and depth of surveillance by the NSA, it has become publicly evident that Silicon Valley is a vital node of the deep state as well. The deep state has also grown to control Congress, its leadership, and some members of the defense and intelligence committees. I then use Mike Lofgren's description of the deep state, which I believe is the most tangible way to visualize it. And I can quote Lofgren here when he says, there is a visible United States government situated in imposing neoclassical buildings around the mall in Washington, D.C., and there is another more shadowy and indefinable government that is not explained in Civics 101 or observable to tourists at the White House or the Capitol. The former is the tip of an iceberg that is theoretically controlled via elections. The subsurface part of the iceberg operates on its own compass, heading regardless of who is formally in power. Now, what I do with that description is I actually map it using all the seven blind man's perspective. I then come up with what is essentially a map of the deep state. I then take Glennon's Trumanite and Madisonian index to try and shade the various influence of the deep state over the various entities, whether they are on a deep state level or the actual government department level. So I'm not sure if your readers can actually see the actual image of the actual mapping of the deep state, but you can clearly see how vast and how amorphous it is. I then go on to try and determine if there is indeed a conspiracy within the deep state and where that conspiracy lies. So using the various, what I call blind men, I actually am able then to show that the actual deep state level, there is no conspiracy. What we are seeing, unfortunately, is a vast influence that comes from the power elite. So the power elite, which pretty much control the corporatocracy, have also parachuted key people into positions within the deep state through what we call the revolving door. And as a result, they have managed to gradually subvert and overtake not just the deep state, which is connected to the government departments, but the entire US government.
Okay. So I guess one question that we should ask for people who are trying to figure out all this terminology is there's always been America was founded, for those who don't know, by a group of slave owners, oligarchic slave owners, who have always resisted democracy. In fact, they never believed in it. And democracy is actually kind of relatively new, particularly universal suffrage. Women didn't get the vote in America until the 1920s. And so when you talk about things like, for example, the Council on Foreign Relations, there's actually a hilarious play or film by one of the editor of Harper's called The Ruling Class, of where someone's goal is to get a job on Wall Street and get in the Council on Foreign Relations, which is, it's not really I guess it's a secret society-ish. I mean, people know where it is and everything. But so the question is, what is the difference between a deep state and just a ruling class? What is it? Mechanical? What would you just see the differences as between just a ruling class of people in the deep state?
I believe that the connections to the corporatocracy is paramount. I believe, like in my actual article, I actually chart and map that the deep state is tethered to the actual corporatocracy and controlled by the power elite. So as a result, they're actually subverting democracy. Their interests lie in gaining more power and profit and subverting what they derogatively refer to as the masses' democracy, or overriding the US Constitution. And as you just mentioned, you could have a ruling class that controls the US government, provided it gave them some semblance of democracy. But what's gradually happened since the Federal Act, which was passed, I believe, in 1914, is that you've gradually had corporations taking over and subverting the visible government. And
right.
What really is required is a separation of corporation and state, much like we have a separation of church and state, or else you're going to have what we have at the moment in the US. You have casino capitalism, and it's led to the 2008 GFC. You have the war on terror, which has led to multiple invasions overseas. And you have environmental destruction, which has all been the cause of all this non-representation and rule of the corporations.
Right, and they are, in a sense, I think this is an interesting parallel that people used to talk about during the Cold War. And I know Sheldon Woolen, who recently died, had a term for the U.S. system, which was inverted totalitarianism. But there was just talk about convergence. I think Daniel Bell talked about it, whereas the Communist Party had a radiating influence through the state of the Soviet Union. They controlled everything and they were in charge. But in the U.S., there is a sort of hidden government, but has much the same deal, which is they control the very top and then they have radiating influence down. And that seems to be what do you think of that model, that idea that it's a lot like the Soviet Union was, but it's hidden, unlike the Soviet Union, where you knew who was in charge. You knew it was the premier, the first secretary, or whatever, but it's an inverted totalitarianism of the corporate state. You don't actually, the people who are in charge are just figureheads. The people behind the scenes actually make the decisions.
If I can actually change that question and actually refer to Putin and his rise and what he did with the oligarchs, I think that would be a more apt description of what the US government is, or the US establishment is currently. So what we have is similar to Yeltsin's Russia. We have an oligarchy, or Sachs calls the corporatocracy, who have gradually taken over the levers of power. Now, one of the reasons why Trump and his administration are so friendly with, I believe, with Putin is because of the example that he set for them. When he took over on the agreement that Yeltsin and the political faction which he took over from were not going to be prosecuted. So they were pretty much given a pardon for all their numerous crimes they had committed prior to that. Once he took over, of course, he then gradually started leveraging out all the oligarchs, including the 7 bankers. Now, he gradually started removing all the oligarchs, and those who complied were allowed to keep their ill-gotten gains. Those who refused and were not, were tried to fight him using their media, were gradually leveraged out. Their media was confiscated and they were gradually made to leave Russia. I believe that is the template for what the Trump administration and his military faction will actually do once they take office.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that's interesting because Professor Stephen Cohen is a Russian studies expert. He does a weekly radio show on with John Batchelor. And at one point he said that when Putin came into power, basically the oligarchs were running everything. And he came in and he left the oligarchs in place, but he laid down the law with them and said, make as much money as you want, but leave the running of the state, leave it alone. And if you don't, there's going to be trouble. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. I'm just saying someone who knows Russia pretty well painted that picture for it. Now, I don't know that we are that. Yeah, I guess you're saying that Trump wants to implement that model here, that maybe someone has come to the decision that the oligarchs have too much control over the running of the government. Is that what you're getting at?
Most definitely. I think he's using Putin as his template. And if I can give you just a little bit of history about the power elite and how they've run the country since 2008, you'll probably get a better understanding. So as everyone knows, 2007, 2008, the global financial crisis saw Wall Street, which is pretty much the foundation of the deep state. It ran the economy into the ground through its casino capitalism. As a result, the actual economy was destroyed. The taxpayers were forced to bail out Wall Street, and the homeowners whose house properties plummeted were not bailed out at all. They were made to pay the tax bill for the destruction caused by Wall Street. They went to Congress, of course, had to go to Congress 2 times before they were bailed out. They promised, the power elite led by Wall Street promised continuously that every quarter there'll be grass shoots, that the economy will be improving. And every quarter, through round after round of quantitative easing, which is another way of saying money printing, the economy has not recovered. It's still anemic. What we're seeing is a continuously widening gulf between the rich and poor and the decimation of the middle class. It's been close to 8 years of no sustained economic recovery. And the military faction, who depends on Wall Street to fund its retirement, have noticed that the economy probably will never recover, and the actions of Wall Street or the corporatocracy has jeopardized the military faction's retirement. As a result, it looks like there has been a steady stream of leaks to Seymour Hersh, commencing in 2013 in the London Review of Books. And what that was, from my perspective, appears to be the military faction's deliberate attempt to undermine the political faction and the corporate faction, also known as the corporatocracy. So what you have is on 19th December 2013, an article called Who's Sarin, published by Seymour Hersh, and it reveals that Turkey supplied sarin gas for the Ghouta attack in order to create a false flag inciting President Obama to bomb Syria. Then on the 17th of April 2014, another article titled The Red Line and the Rat Line reveals how a CIA rat line from Libya to Syria was sending heavy weapons to the Syrian terrorists, which resulted in the death of US Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 others. In a third article titled The Killing of Osama bin Laden, published on 21st of May 2015, Seymour Hersh debunks the Obama administration's entire clumsy cover-up of the killing of Osama bin Laden. In fact, based on his story, he was kept in a safe house by the Pakistanis, funded by the Saudis, which we all know are the foundation of the Salafist and terrorist movement. They are the key financiers of the entire worldwide terrorists. They're most likely doing that through the CIA, which they can plausibly deny. But we all know that they're the ones who have created all these covert forces used by the CIA to overthrow sovereign nations such as Syria. It goes on to detail how the Pakistanis sold him to the US, who then sent in a SEAL team to murder him in cold blood, as well as mutilating his body and tossing it out over the Hindu Kush mountains. Then on a 7th January 2016 article titled Military to Military, what we have revealed is an exasperated military faction revealing intelligence information to the Syrians via allied military to counter the al-Nusra terrorists. Now, what the military faction is pretty much telling us in these leaks is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are the head of the military faction, appears to have been exasperated by the fact that they were actually funding, arming, and supporting the same terrorists that killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11. So it reached a point where they couldn't, in all good faith, continue this, and they appear to have leaked all this information. Now, what's significant is that General Flynn, at that time, he took a radical stand against Islam and was against Al-Qaeda, whose ranks were expanding thanks to the political faction and the corporations through the CIA. So what you get is a series of one-sided leaks from the military. And as you know, General Flynn at the time was removed as head of the DIA in 2014, thanks to Obama. And what's happened since then, as you can clearly see, is the US 2016 elections. The military faction has supported President Trump now, who has come from nowhere to demolish the Republican and Democratic party machines and to end the Bush and the Clinton dynasties. He's destroyed the political faction as we know it. And in the process of doing that, he's also delegitimized the actual corporate-owned media. So it's been a stunning win, and it signals a change in pace.
This is interesting. So I really get I was a little confused initially, but this does make sense, because for those who don't know Putin's background, is Putin actually represented the traditional Russian state because he was former KGB, which in Russia is actually not like the CIA. It's huge. There's a KGB branch in every province. It's a real constituency. It's a lot of people. And he kind of was restoring the state power against these corrupt oligarchs, Korodovsky, all the rest of them. And what you're saying, I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that Trump, the faction supporting Trump, you're saying like the faction in the Russian politics that supported Putin because it's more traditional power, doesn't like it's a rival faction within the government, which I don't know, in my mind, I just keep thinking back to the fact that Pentagon-backed rebels in Syria are fighting CIA-backed rebels in Syria, which I think is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever read, but it's apparently true, and the Los Angeles Times reported that. So you're saying a faction within the power elite backed Trump. Is that what I'm...
Correct.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So people who are characterizing this as deep state versus Trump, that doesn't really paint the right picture. You're saying a part of the deep state is actually pushing back against other parts of the deep state. And Trump is actually part of the deep state, or was, until he now became part of the visible government.
What I'm saying is that Trump has put into position key generals. Now, just a rundown, you have General Mattis, of course, who was responsible for covering up the Haditha massacre and the Battle of Fallujah, in which his troops used white phosphorus, which was a violation of international law. And you have General Michael Flynn, as I mentioned earlier, who was kicked out of the DIA but has now returned as National Security Advisor. You have General John Kelly, who's going to head Homeland Security, and he appears to be disillusioned from the corporate faction's endless wars. His son, of course, was killed in Afghanistan in 2010. You have Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State, who has close ties with Russia and has received an Order of Friendship medal. So what we have is the military faction is taking over. It's pretty much demolished the political faction in the last election and is now battling the actual corporate faction or the corporatocracy and its media, who is throwing a lot of mud at the Trump presidency.
So what's the difference between that and a military coup?
They can't actually take over in a military coup. It'd be too obvious. The deep state controls the government via the masses and democratic elections. It's far better to manipulate the system rather than overtly taking over. So it's more efficient for them, and people will believe more of the democratic fairy tale if they go through the proper channels.
And obviously they're not using force.
Yeah, but I may add, I'm not sure if you guys were watching the campaign by Trump, but he did refer to the fact that if he was to be assassinated, there would be civil war. Now, that was, in my opinion, a veiled threat from the military faction that if, as has happened previously in JFK and his brother, that they happen to be assassinated for all these changes, then there may be martial law which will ensconce the military faction even deeper. This is what is petrifying the corporate faction and its media who are just panicking at the moment.
Well, here's a question about the media, because that's something we cover a lot, at least here, because we have to deal with it and we're inundated with it. And a lot of those stories of what people know come from the corporate media because it's so pervasive, at least at the moment. I mean, when you say they're controlled, and this is what's always been a question among everybody in this country, are they useful idiots? Are they operatives? I mean, this is what's always I always think they're just kind of incompetent, but are you saying that you think, I mean, what's their level of involvement with that faction? Are they just getting fed stories and they need to hit a deadline? They don't really care if it's true? Or are they actually, is it something about they have the same values?
It's pretty much the narrative is set from high above. The power elites set the narrative and they all must adhere to it like a great big echo chamber. They all follow each other and distribute the same propaganda. For example, at the moment, it's the Russians who are the evil empire. They want to surround Russia, put bases in Ukraine and send more troops into Europe. So what you are seeing is an echo chamber effect. No one actually shows you a map of all the US bases on the border of Russia or even the South China Sea, for example, with the Chinese. It's called the South China Sea, not the South America Sea, yet somehow the US people are told that we have to station and protect the South China Sea against the Chinese. It makes no sense to someone who has any inkling of history or geography.
So I just had, because you're in Australia, I had to think of this, which goes to the deep state in a sort of global system. So in 1972, Australia had its Labour Prime Minister. His name was Gough Whitlam. And
Gough Whitlam.
Excuse me, Gough Whitlam. And
yes,
what we found out through U.S. congressional investigations, these are in the Church Committee and the Pike Committee for those trying to do research on this, is CIA Director William Colby was told or believed, based on his intelligence reports, that his prime minister was going to not only take Australia out of Vietnam, not only create an Indian Ocean, quote unquote, peace zone, but was going to shut down a key vital U.S. signal intelligence base called Pine Gap, which is in Australia. And according to what was revealed in the investigation, he contacted MI6 and said, Australia is traditionally your domain. Can you intervene? And what happened after that was the U.S., MI6, and the Australian intelligence services, the ASIO, conducted a kind of quiet coup against him, Wilhelm, and basically through using forged documents, media manipulation, of which Rupert Murdoch was apparently involved in, basically did a kind of Watergate, what they tried to do to Nixon administration did to its opponents in the primaries. And apparently it worked, because in 1975 he resigned amidst scandal, which was later revealed to be not even really, there was no real scandal. It was all this propaganda, this black propaganda that had been done by the intelligence services. So it looks like the deep state isn't just nationalistic. If the Australian intelligence services are participating with the U.S. and British intelligence services, it seems like the deep state is not strictly national, doesn't it?
Yeah, if I can just add one more little thing to that. Some of these operations, as Dan brought up, are multiple intelligence agencies working together. And I read that the CIA, if they are working with MI6, let's say, that is under a different legal authority. It's in a liaison role, and they don't have to report to the oversight committees. And I've heard it referred to as a safari club or something like that. Is when different, I think, U.S., British, French, probably Australian intelligence work together. There's actually a name for that sort of.
No, the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes does not include France. So basically, what happens is it's the UK, the British intelligence, Australia, and New Zealand, and at one point it also included South Africa when it was under apartheid. So what's crazy about this story that revealed, and as an Australian or someone who's lived in Australia might want to, is the ASIO was providing the CIA with dossiers on both members of the Labour government as well as private citizens in Australia. Now that strikes me as an incredibly disloyal act for the Australian intelligence agencies to be providing the CIA with intelligence dossiers on private citizens who happen to be anti-war or whatever. What do you think of that?
It also supports, in David's article, some of the 7 people the men that he quotes, believe that there is no conspiracy. The deep state doesn't have it's headless. And the minority of them said, no, there is. There's a cabal. There's somebody calling the shot. But David, did you come to the conclusion that it is headless, that there is no sort of head of the deep state?
Just first, with the first question from Daniel regarding the Australian deep state. So yes, there is also an Australian deep state. There are entities that control the Australian government. For example, when we helped George Bush invade Iraq in 2003, Australia was gifted the Australian Free Trade Agreement, which benefited the mining companies and, of course, the banks here. So that was one of the rewards for our involvement in this war on terror. And the Australian government, of course, has also subverted its democracy through removal of Gough Whitlam, thanks to external covert forces, or, as you say, intelligence agencies who have helped do that. So we are far from blameless. Australia is also just as guilty as the US in having a deep state. The only difference I might add is that the Australian deep state isn't as subverted, isn't as corrupted, isn't as corrosive as the American deep state. And the Australian deep state does not control its fingers on nuclear missiles and has bases stationed throughout the known world, which makes it less intrusive than the American deep state. Now, back to can you please repeat that last question?
When Dan brought up the fact that operation to the regime change operation in Australia involved multiple intelligence agencies from different countries. That brought up something I remembered from your article where you noted that the majority of the 7 men who you quote to come to your unified theory on deep state, Most of them thought that the deep state is headless, that there's no sort of group, there's no leader, there's no cabal, if you will, sort of calling the shot. So it made me wonder, with just taking the one example of the regime change in Australia, I mean, that makes me lean toward thinking that there is someone calling the shots. I don't know.
The deep state is quite big, and there are multiple levels, as I map in my article. There are different strategies or different tactics at the various levels. For example, within the power elite level, definitely there is a conspiracy, as detailed in my article. The power elite are just the political, military, and corporate leaders who actually plan all of this. Now, I'll give you an example of that conspiracy. If you guys recall, after the 2001 9/11 terror attacks, General Wesley Clark mentioning 7 countries that they wish to invade in 5 years. He went to a general in the Pentagon who showed him this memo, and he referred to invading, starting with Iraq. Then we're going to move on to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Now, when Wesley Clark asked the general, why are we invading these countries? He was clueless. He pretty much looked like a kangaroo in the headlights and said, I suppose if you have hammers, all problems look like nails. So what you have here is a clear indication that there are people within the Pentagon, within the military, who are pretty much Trumanites. And in other words, they believe that they're doing their duty. They aren't part of a conspiracy. They are trying their best to defend their country. But there is someone above them, someone like Wolfowitz, who, after the Gulf War of 91, planned on taking out these countries again, as Wesley Clark details. So there are specific people within the power elite who have planned these interventions. And as you know, of those 7 countries, the majority are now being invaded and either destabilized or overthrown. You have, since 2001, you have the overt invasions under the George Bush presidency. And then under Obama, you have the covert invasions using Salafist or terrorist death squads that have invaded the regions such as Libya and Syria and attempted to destabilize and overthrow the governments there.
Right. And in those cases, who you're talking about, at least in our country, is there is a sort of policy wonk set. And here we have, at least in the George W. Bush administration, they were called neoconservatives, which the Project for the New American Century was a place where they rallied around. One of those people actually existed in both administrations. Robert Kagan was a major leader in the Project for New American Century. He was in a Bush advisor, so was Will Kristol. But when they got pushed out because of the failures of the Iraq War in part, Bob Kagan became an advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He entered, and his wife, Victoria Nuland, was instrumental in the coup in Ukraine. So it seems like there is this sort of, I guess, see, the thing about deep state, is it permanent bureaucrats and these intellectuals who shift in and out of administrations?
If I had to guess, I would say that the power elite who own the corporatocracy parachute key members into, for example, the secret societies or the political action groups such as PNAC. And then you have the Kagan Fellows and all these other guys who then are able to set up plans to overthrow sovereign nations. And then when you have the 9/11 attack, they were able then to swing into action and implement these plans that have been on the shelf for so long. So it all looks like it's happening spontaneously, but there are people behind the scenes who have planned for years, who have prepared for this eventuality, and who then swing into action as soon as the crisis develops.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it. Yeah, because that actually happened, interestingly, from a civil liberties dimension here. The Patriot Act in the United States, was overnight. There was a 1,000-page bill, and people said, geez, they really came up with this bill. And what they found out was, no, this is what the FBI, the CIA, this is what they've been asking for years. All they did was pull it off the shelf when people got panicked, and nobody read it. In fact, one of the congressmen, a guy I kind of respect, John Conyers, said nobody read the bill. They just voted it because they were scared out of their minds after 9/11. So there is this sort of permanent bureaucracy, but there also is these sort of people that come in and out. They're in the Council on Foreign Relations, they're in PNAC, they're in the American Enterprise Institute. There's these think tank set who write these plans up and then just wait for a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, as Rahm Emanuel once said, right? And so they just sort of wait for a crisis. They wait for an opening. I think that's in Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, which is, they wait to try this privatization schemes out until Hurricane Katrina, where they went in and basically said, well, okay, well, now we can privatize the schools. That seems like you're right. I think that's a good model. They put it on the shelf and then they just wait for a moment.
Some members of PNAC, for example, I think his name is Fukushima, who at the end of the invasion, he actually turns against the neocons. And he is, for example, shocked at what happened, and he renounces what they have done. So you do have some people that begin within these groups who are suckered into going along and conducting these invasions. Another one might be Jeffrey Sachs. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, of course, at the time, he's assisted bankers, and he's gone into Russia, privatized and created this disaster capitalism. And since then, he appears to have backtracked, thank God, and he's realized what's happened, and he appears to be trying to clear his name. And I did have a chance to speak to him, and he was quite helpful when I wrote up my articles. So I do understand that these aren't people standing around in some dark boardroom rubbing their hands together saying we're going to take over the world, but what you have is legitimate people whose interests are to help the US government and the people, who are then subverted by the power elites, chosen people who they parachute into key entities and key groups.
Yeah, and Fukuyama and Sachs, like Francis Fukuyama, which I think is who you're talking about.
Correct. Yes. Sorry, I think I mispronounced his name.
Yeah, he's not a Japanese city that nuclear reaction. He wrote, he was a true believer. He wrote a book that's now looks ridiculous, but he was a true believer called The End of History, which was basically that we're done with, it's all about liberal development. And
he was neocon.
Yeah, he was neocon. There you go. Good. And he's turned the other way on this stuff, as is Jeffrey Sachs, who was part of this sort of, Russian invasion of Western elites with Larry Summers, who is not very repentant, unlike Jeffrey Sachs. But it seems as soon as they do that, as soon as they have an awakening that what they were doing was harmful, they get sidelined right away. And there's really no way to look at that other than the elite saying, well, you're no longer with the program. You're out. You're out. If you don't believe in this anymore, get out. Because Fukuyama is not really a factor anymore in politics or government. And to be quite honest, neither is Jeffrey Sachs. So it looks like once they get off the dogma, or once they get off the doctrine or the talking points or whatever, they're kind of quickly sidelined and new people take their place, which makes the deep state very resilient, doesn't it?
Very resilient.
A current example of that, and something that kind of baffles me, is so you have Michael Flynn in a, I don't know, if not the most powerful position in the administration, one of the most. And sometimes based on what's in the media, I wonder, is the battle really against Trump or is it against Michael Flynn? They seem to be really worried about him. So, I wonder where do the neocons fit in to the Trump administration? Because Michael Flynn, he said some really good things about ISIS pushing back against using the extremists and jihadis as our ground troops. But he also co-wrote a book with Michael Ledeen. I don't know much about Ledeen, but
I do, and he's an absolute whack job. That's what. Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. I don't understand this part of the picture. Maybe Flynn had a moment, had a kind of breakthrough, I guess. But you're right. That Michael Ledeen is a very hardcore neocon. That's interesting. That's right. He did write a book with Michael Ledeen, but that was years ago. Maybe he's.
Actually, I thought it was fairly recently.
Oh, was it? Oh, then I'm really confused.
From what I've heard, it appears that, from the writing style and all that, it appears that really it was written by Ledeen, or like 75% written by Ledeen. And, Flynn had his name on it. But still, that is a baffling and seemingly contradictory detail here. Now, maybe what you said makes sense too, or maybe Ledeen, I don't know, came around. I don't know enough about him to say. Just throw that detail in there to really confuse us.
Just throwing that out there.
If I can go back to the theory of everything and what it's telling me, and based on my interpretation, I think we are at a unique time in US history. Not since the Reagan administration has the change been so great. So what you were seeing is that there's a schism within the power elite. As I said, the military versus the corporatocracy or the corporate faction, and the political faction, which has been pretty much decimated. Now, what's happening is this signals the end of neoliberalism. This is the end of neoliberalism after 40 years. So what Trump is introducing is economic nationalism. And what that means for the people is similar to the Brexit, and it will be a totally different world. There will be cutting of immigration, protectionism, repatriation of money, and the rebuilding of US infrastructure, and of course manufacturing, which they'll use to get their way out of the debt. So the plans of the Wall Street cartel, or the lobby which was in charge for so long, have failed. Since the 2008 GFC, they haven't managed to get their way out of their debt, and as a result, the military faction has decided to take over, and their plan is to rebuild manufacturing, and that will involve, of course, a weaker US dollar, and this will all put pressure on the corporations who will be screaming murder and will try to stop Trump as much as they can using their media. Now that's what's happening in terms of tactics, but strategically, the US's unilateral moment that George Bush Sr. called the New World Order is effectively over. So We're seeing the zenith of US military power. What they are talking about now, using the military faction, is teaming up with Russia. So what you're looking at is bilateral approach, or bilateral way of looking at the world. You'll have Russia, given its sphere of influence, most likely they will trade Ukraine, and they may tell Russia to stay out of Iran. They probably let Russia hang on to Syria, but they might tell Russia that Iran is ours. They're going to strengthen, of course, Israel, who is pretty much their hitman, who they use to knock off non-compliant nations within the Middle East. They're going to strengthen Saudi Arabia, who pretty much is the petrodollar basket of the US. In other words, the US dollar is backed by black gold in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, whereas previously it was backed by gold at Fort Knox, guarded by the US Army. It is now backed by black gold guarded by Fort Israel, if I can use that analogy. So what we are seeing now is the end of the unilateral moment of the US empire.
Wow, that's a great analogy. That's a really interesting point to make. And, I think if that is correct, and this is all, we're all trying to analyze this changing world, but if neoliberalism is actually over and the Washington Consensus, which was sort of the U.S. imperialist model with the IMF and the World Bank, the sort of neo-colonialism, going around and imposing the free market standards and imposing either through the point of a bayonet or through bribery. And we're now going to return to instead of global hegemony, a more multilateral, negotiated diplomatic situation. That is going to put a lot of people in the U.S. power structure or the power elite really, because these people did great under globalization. These people did great under the sort of victory lap. And yeah, they're going to fight.
But it's not sustainable. As you can see, economically, it's not sustainable. Militarily, the U.S. has lost nearly all its wars in this last generation. As a result, they're only allowing Russia its sphere of influence. They're still going to try and bottle up China. They're still going to threaten Iran. They're going to continue to support the Saudi Arabian regime, which is the source of all known global jihadi terror throughout the world, and who was responsible for 9/11 attacks that killed 3,000 innocent Americans. They're going to still support Israel, who continues to steal land from the Palestinians and create Zionist apartheid state there. So little is changing, but the most important thing is that neoliberalism for the US is dead, and that what you're going to see is economic nationalism now.
Yeah, but you're right in that the sort of, if you look at if you wake up the next day and neoliberal model has ended, maybe that's January 21st. What you're going to see is going to look a lot like the world that it did before, but the difference is the ideology. See, neoconservatism was perfect for neoliberalism because it gave it a global, universal justification for military intervention. Everybody wants to be America. Everybody, inside every person, there's an American trying to get out. But if you just drop that ideology, which Trump absolutely did, and in the primaries, did he let Jeb Bush have it and all these other people? It was fun to watch. then you basically are back to a sort of more, I guess, reversion to the mean of state national interest power politics. You no longer have this sort of mission to civilize or unilateralism. So the world looks the same, but it's a lot different guiding point for the power elite, isn't it? If that ideology takes over, or lack of ideology.
I believe they'll be conducting a rearguard action. The US empire has reached its zenith, and now it's going to have to retract logically, economically, and militarily. They've overextended, and Trump realizes this. He's going to gradually start pulling back all his troops, closing off the bases, because it's unsustainable as we speak. And part of that is to initially grant Russia its own sphere of influence, and who knows, maybe China later on. But for now, it looks like they've reached the limits of the US super empire.
As one indicator of that would support this theory is that you're familiar with Zbigniew Brzezinski. I think he definitely would qualify as part of the deep state. Well, he was going on his grand chessboard theory for a long time. I think it was written in the 90s, and he believed that you have to control Central Asia as the key to the world island, and it's really based on someone else's heartland theory from before that. But he's done a complete turnaround very recently. He wrote an article sort of abandoning the empire goals, and now we could do a whole nother show on that theory itself, but he has definitely made a big change. Just that would support your theory.
He wanted to actually allow China its sphere of influence, but what looks like is happening is Trump's administration is instead teaming up with Russia.
He's saying that Russia should be part of Europe.
He initially said that he wanted to break the Russian state by taking Ukraine, because he said, with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia is just another country, and it's not going to pose any geopolitical threat. But that was in the grand chessboard.
Correct.
But it looks
Ukraine
like
is a geopolitical pivot.
Correct, right. And so now it looks like, after it's clear that Putin is not willing to just give it up without a fight, and the U.S. isn't really willing to go to nuclear war over it, that was my interpretation of that piece as well, Joanne, that he has kind of basically said, okay, we pushed NATO all the way across Europe, we got right in their face, and we blinked. They didn't blink, we blinked. And they hadn't done enough damage, apparently, in the 90s to make them forget that they had a historic connection to Ukraine, I guess is a takeaway from that.
I guess one other thing that I thought about, and with your definition of, actually with all these seven men, their definition of the deep state. If I recall correctly, only one of them mentioned any foreign influence as part of the deep state. And I don't know, I see a lot more than that in real life here, but mostly through the funding of NGOs and other things, I guess, that we're not even aware of, where funding is actually hidden, and some of these entities are constructed such that the real funding is not transparent. So, any thoughts on that? Is there we have the military, the economic, the different
civil society, right?
Societies. Should there be a slot in there for other countries?
The actual article, I only was able to use 7 blind men, which I call them, even though they are, in my opinion, giants, considering the work that they have created. But I was only able to reference 7 people in order to chart this map. As you just mentioned, there are, of course, extensive links internationally between the corporatocracy, which consists of multinational corporations with bases throughout the world. So they have extensive links. We have the NGOs, other groups, political action groups and committees such as AIPAC and such as the Saudis, who are also connected to the CIA. And all these groups, of course, work together to ensure that all their plans are fulfilled.
So I think we've probably taken up enough of your time. David, anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Yes, just to quote Trump, he hasn't come to drain the swamp. All he's going to do is put fences around the alligators.
I like that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, thanks so much, Dan and David. David,
thanks, Dave.
Again, thanks so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Joanne and Daniel.
Have a good one, bud.
Take care.
Have a great one, guys.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Okay, that's our show. Thank you for listening. Special thank you to David Chibo. You can see him on Twitter at DCHIBO. You can read his recent work at UNZ Review, UNZ Review. If you'd like to support the show, please see us at Patreon, patreon.com/Around the Empire. $5 a month helps us put on the show. Questions, comments, just want to yell at me, Dan@shatterproof.com, and see my and Joanne's work at shatterproof.com. See you next time.